G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here with episode 7 of Australia's Day of National Shame. Book reading of Darwin 1942, Australia's Darkest Hour by Timothy Hall, which I have to keep to under 15 minutes because Google, YouTube and BBC Worldwide between them can't get their head around the fact that my movie was up for 2.5 years before BBC Nature Events asked for my permission to use my content, and when I granted it, it took them 6 months to make their documentary and air it, and then 1 month after they aired their documentary using my footage that was 3 years old, they put a copyright strike against me, deleted the movie from my channel, took away 17,500 movie views and cut me back to 15 minutes. So, the mistakes. Lou Kernock's warning of the approach of unidentified aircraft over Bathurst Island was telephoned to RAAF operations at 9:37. The message was taken by Pilot Officer Richard Saxton, one of the officers on duty, and from that moment it became enmeshed in a web of the most extraordinary incompetence. The procedure that had been laid down for dealing with reports of unidentified aircraft was quite specific and very long-winded. If it came through Darwin radio, it was to be passed first to RAAF operations, who in theory were the only people capable of verifying whether it was friend or foe. They in turn would pass it to Area Command Headquarters (ACH), which was situated in a separate building a few hundred metres away. At ACH there were more Air Force officers as well as representatives of the Navy and the Army, and it was their role to pass any intelligence reports to their respective headquarters, where there were still more officers waiting to evaluate or act on them. The idea behind ACH was that it was a central clearinghouse, and it was supposed to ensure that all three services, as well as the civilians in town, received a warning of an impending air raid at the same time. If either the Navy or the Army received a report of an unidentified aircraft, they too had to pass it on to RAAF operations so that it could be identified. There was good reason for caution. Only 2 hours before the raid, the anti-aircraft detachment at Fanny Bay to the north of the town had tried to shoot down 6 RAAF Hudson bombers, all heavily laden with Australian and American servicemen being evacuated from Timor. The Army had made a wrong identification. Aircraft identification was never one of the anti-aircraft battalion's strong points at Darwin. It's like saying fucking librarians can't read. And mercifully for the men on the Hudsons, their aim was just as bad. Okay. A disaster was avoided, but the incident did nothing to improve the already strained relations between the RAAF and the Army. The whole communication system between the RAAF, ACH and the other two services in the town was fraught with danger and almost bound to break down. Frequently there were as many as 5 people involved in assessing a single report between the first alert and the final instruction to sound the alarms. On 19 February it caused a disaster. Pilot Officer Saxton normally worked his shifts, 2 hours on and 2 hours off, with 2 other officers, a flight lieutenant as controller and another pilot officer. That morning his 2 regular colleagues were both sick with dengue fever, and their place had been taken by 2 other officers with whom he did not usually work. Perhaps this played a small part in the complete breakdown of communications that followed. The controller was Flight Lieutenant Cecil Gordon Fenton, a veteran of the First World War, and the pilot officer was Harold Gillette, a former NCO in the Rifle Corps and before that a Sydney journalist. Shortly before the mission signal had been passed by VID, the RAAF operations room had been notified that a squadron of 11 American P-40 Kitty Hawks, which had taken off from the RAAF base only 10 minutes before, had been forced to turn back by bad weather. The wrong identification of the Japanese as these Kitty Hawks would later be used as an excuse for the failure of the RAAF to sound the alert that would have warned the other services, the ships in the harbour, the RAAF station and the town itself that a raid was imminent. Gillette heard Saxton call out, repeating the message from Darwin radio, and then he heard Fenton add loudly, quote, "They may be the American aircraft." Fenton plotted on his chart the position where he calculated the P-40 should have been, and somehow made it appear that it roughly corresponded with the position of the aircraft reported by the mission on Bathurst Island. About 2 minutes had now passed, and he took the signal downstairs to the station commander, Wing Commander Stuart Griffith, whose office was directly below the operations room. He added his belief that they were probably the P-40s. On the other side of the partition, the adjutant, Squadron Leader Andrew Swan, heard the conversation. Swan heard Griffith reply, "I will come up," and a short time later saw him walk past his door. 4 minutes had now elapsed. Fenton went back upstairs ahead of Griffith. By then, the operations room had committed one of the most unpardonable breaches of procedure. It had failed to pass on the message to Area Command Headquarters, where the officers of all three services were responsible for passing it on to their own headquarters and for warning the town. Now, at about 9:42, Fenton did telephone ACH. There seems little doubt about this, even though the three RAAF officers at ACH all emphatically denied afterwards that they had received any notification from the operations room at all. In all probability, the message was taken by the senior officer at the ACH, Lieutenant Commander Sterling Cobbold of the Royal Australian Navy. It is only, quote, probable because at the subsequent Royal Commission into the fiasco there were almost as many versions of what happened as there were men on duty that morning. It is clear, though, that by 9:42 Cobbold had received the message with the rider that the aircraft were probably American. He in turn communicated with Lieutenant Francis Glynn, the Staff Officer, Operations at Naval Headquarters, passing on the message but inadvertently twisting the qualification just enough now for it to be now passed on as, quote, "Don't do anything, we think they are our own," unquote. It was now 9:45. Glynn reported the message at once to the senior staff officer at Naval Headquarters and then walked to the office of the senior naval officer, Captain Edward Thomas, the man who had been so certain that a raid would take place that day. Thomas was on the phone and Glynn turned to go back to his office, but on reflection decided that the message was important enough to interrupt Thomas. He went back and interrupted him. With Thomas was the Director of Naval Intelligence in Darwin, Lieutenant Commander James McManus, and although there was no precise record kept of the time that Glynn passed on the message to them, both men looked at their watches and said, "We've got 12 minutes before they arrive." It was 9:46. Weeks before, the two men had calculated that an aircraft travelling at 140 knots would take 12 minutes to cover the 17 kilometres from Bathurst Island to Darwin. Yet, in spite of this, no alarm was sounded. McManus said later that he had wanted to sound it immediately, but that he had been overruled. The only person who could have overruled him was Thomas himself, and he was so certain that a raid was imminent that it is unthinkable that he would have delayed sounding the alarm unless the message from Cobbold had suggested very strongly that the aircraft were American. At ACH, Cobbold waited for confirmation, which never came, as precious minutes ticked by. He later defended his action in not giving Naval Headquarters instructions to sound the alarm. He had authority to give the orders, on the grounds that whatever he personally thought of the likelihood that they were Japanese aircraft, it was a decision for RAAF operations. Quote, "I not only had a perfect reason to leave the identification to the RAAF," he said, "but I had to do so," unquote. But if the Navy got a deceptively misleading signal, that at least was one better than the Army. They got nothing. The Army's representative at ACH was Major Charles Smith, who was also the liaison officer between 7th Military District Headquarters at Larrakia Barracks and the RAAF, a job that took up most of his time. Apart from alerting the anti-aircraft batteries by way of a message to Larrakia Barracks, the Army's role at ACH was considered less important than the RAAF's or the Navy's until there was an actual invasion. It was common knowledge that there was little love lost between Cobbold and Smith, who had served with the Light Horse in Palestine and in civilian life was a clerk with the Melbourne Tramways. Smith was adamant that between 9:37, when VID passed the warning, and 9:58, when the raid started, he had no knowledge of any kind that there were aircraft flying over Bathurst Island. For all that time, he said, he was working in his office with his duty sergeant. There is equally no doubt that the responsibility for passing the message to Smith rested with whichever officer first received it, who in this case was Cobbold. Indeed, Cobbold said that he had passed the message on to Smith, to which Smith retorted that it was very odd if he had, because he had never known Cobbold to pass anything on to him at any time. What was more, he said, it was absurd to think that if he had known even of the remote possibility that the aircraft were Japanese, that he would not have alerted the anti-aircraft batteries. Pressed to explain Smith's adamant denial that he had been given the signal, Cobbold varied his story, lawyers hate that, means you're a liar, and said that, quote, if Smith didn't hear anything, then it was because his door was shut. Sandpit politics, isn't it? And later still he conceded that, quote, Smith was awkwardly situated in the building and perhaps with the amount of work that was going on he didn't receive the message, unquote. In fact, Smith's office was only 6 metres away. Smith found himself continually frustrated by the almost non-existent cooperation between the Navy, the Air Force and the Army at ACH. On one occasion, Cobbold deliberately suppressed an urgent message from Makassar Strait which should have been passed on to the Army, on the ground that, quote, the Army was getting too much naval information, unquote. The situation then was that when the raid began, Cobbold had told Naval Headquarters that the signal was probably a false alarm and that they were not to act on it, and the Army had been told nothing at all, or at least they had been told nothing by ACH, for it transpired that the Army had actually received its own information about the Japanese aircraft in an urgent signal from a forward gun position, and that it too had failed to pass on this vital signal to anyone else. The Army's contribution to the confusion had all the hallmarks of a very clumsy attempt to deliberately confuse anyone trying to find out the truth. Major General Blake's log showed that a message was received from the 23rd Australian Infantry Brigade Post M4, bracket, which was further north up the coast towards Bathurst Island, reading, quote, planes approaching from seaward flying at great height unable to identify, unquote. Although this message was sent at 9:38, it was only received at 9:50, a delay that Blake explained as unavoidable given the various stages that the message would have to pass through before it reached him. But if that seemed peculiar, even more strange was the next entry in the log which noted, quote, immediately telephoned ACH and repeated message, unquote. This too was shown as occurring at 9:50. Nobody, Smith, Cobbold or the RAAF officers, ever received it. So what happened to it? Perhaps the answer can be found in the entry itself. Signals were written into the log and given consecutive reference numbers, but on this occasion the entry was not only given the intermediate number 124A, but it had been squeezed into the space between 124 and 125 in such a way that it had obviously been added later. The possibility that it was a fake was so obvious that 3 weeks later the Royal Commissioner questioned the man responsible for keeping the log, Intelligence Officer William Gill, very closely about its origin. Indeed, counsel assisting the Commissioner asked Gill if the entry had been made on Major General Blake's personal instructions when it was heard that the Commission was coming to Darwin, quote, and it was thought desirable that some story had to be made up so that those interfering lawyers would have something to bite their teeth on, unquote. The suggestion was understandably strongly denied by both Gill and Blake himself, but they had no other explanation for the suspicious entry. It seems most unlikely that the Army passed the message to ACH or to either of the other services, and certainly not to the Air Raid Patrol in the town, which had still been told nothing by anybody. The proper procedure was that the ARP would be notified immediately by the RAAF if they received the message first, then by ACH and then by Larrakia Barracks. In this way it was thought that there was no possibility of the town being inadvertently overlooked when there was an alarm. The responsibility for the level of the alarm which would be sounded by different signals on the sirens rested with ACH. What the Army did do, however, was to alert its anti-aircraft batteries. Again, it did not move particularly fast because the log showed that the guns were warned at 9:56, but this at least allowed them to be in position and ready for action when the raid started. Even 2 minutes warning would have been better than nothing for the ships on the harbour. At the barracks themselves there was no warning at all. They had chosen that day to dismantle the sirens to service them. Like the Nanunda's engines, eh? If the entry in the log about the signal to ACH was false, the reason was clear enough. It should have been passed to ACH, and as the Royal Commissioner implied, it would save the Army a great deal of embarrassment if there was written evidence that this had been done. I think I'm probably close to be 14 minuets out of the 15 that I'm now allowed to upload after the copy wrong strike.